They taught you Rome was white. But Rome ruled Africa, was built by Africa, and for centuries, Africa helped rule Rome.
Let me just say it straight so we can stop playing. At its territorial peak, the Roman Empire controlled North Africa from Morocco to Egypt, the entire Nile Delta, the Horn of Africa's trade corridors, the Levant, and chunks of sub-Saharan territory through client kingdoms. North Africa and Egypt alone held somewhere between 13 and 20 million people, depending on which historian's estimate you use. The European portion of the empire sat at around 23 million. That means roughly 1 in every 3 Romans, if you count everyone living under Roman rule and Roman law, was from the African continent. Add the Middle Eastern and Arab populations of Greater Syria and Anatolia, and the white European slice of that empire drops to under half. The Roman Empire was not a white European project. It was a Mediterranean and African superstate that Europe later claimed as its exclusive ancestor, stripped of everyone else who built it and hung on the wall like a family portrait with half the family cut out. And tonight, we're putting them back in the frame. Pull up a map of Rome at its height under Emperor Trajan in 117 AD and actually look at it without the modern political boundaries coloring your assumptions. The empire wraps around the entire Mediterranean Sea like a fist. North Africa, what is now Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt isn't a footnote on that map. It's a spine. The southern rim of the empire, from the Atlantic coast of Morocco all the way to the Nile Delta, is roughly 4,000 miles of territory that Rome controlled, taxed, built roads through, stationed legions in, and drew its wealth from. The province of Africa Proconsularis, roughly modern Tunisia, and coastal Libya, was described by Roman writers as the second wealthiest province in the entire empire, behind only Italy itself. It was said to feed Rome for 8 months of every year, while Egypt covered the other 4. 8 months. The city of Rome, 1 million people crammed onto 7 hills, 8 because of African soil, African farmers, and African labor. The lights stayed on in the capital because Africa kept sending grain up the Mediterranean. So when you picture Rome and you picture marble columns and togas and Latin speeches and European faces, you are picturing the front door of a house whose entire foundation was black and brown. Now let's do the actual math, because numbers don't have a political agenda. Historian Balak's classic 1886 estimate of the empire under Augustus gives a total population of about 54 million. His figure for the North African portion alone is 11.5 million. Egypt adds another 5 million, which historians of the ancient world widely accept because Egypt was one of the most densely populated regions on Earth in antiquity, with about 167 people per square kilometer. Extraordinary for a pre-industrial society. So you're already at 16 to 17 million people from the African continent before you count a single person in Italy, Spain, Gaul, or Britain. More recent scholarly estimates for the mid-2nd century empire push the total population up to 70 or even 75 million. At those numbers, with Egypt at 5 million and North Africa at 8 million, according to the Harper 2017 table that historians currently favor, Africa is still sitting at over 17% of the total empire by itself. Add the Syrian and Arabian provinces, add the Anatolian and Greek East, and you have a situation where The blonde-haired, blue-eyed toga crowd that Hollywood keeps casting represents maybe a quarter to a third of the people who actually lived under Roman rule. And that's before we get into the genetic question of what North Africans in the 1st and 2nd century actually looked like, which we'll come back to because that's where it gets genuinely explosive. Africa Proconsularis is the province that makes the whole argument, and most people have never heard of it by name. Established in 146 BC, after Rome obliterated Carthage in the Third Punic War, it roughly covered what is now Tunisia, northeastern Algeria, and the Libyan coast along the Gulf of Sidra. This territory was inhabited by Berber peoples, whom the Romans called Numidians and Mari, who had been indigenous to North Africa for thousands of years. Berbers in antiquity were not the same as modern definitions of Berber ethnicity, which is already diverse. Ancient Berbers in this region ranged across a wide spectrum of complexion and feature, including populations in the interior and southern regions with significant sub-Saharan admixture from thousands of years of trans-Saharan contact. The Garamantes, a Berber people of the Fezzan region in Libya, were explicitly described by Roman writers as having contacts deep into sub-Saharan territory, and Roman expeditions under the early empire pushed south through Garamantian territory to make contact with populations living well below the Sahara. The empire's African footprint wasn't just the coastline. It had fingers reaching into Central Africa in ways that barely get mentioned in the standard curricula. Within Africa Proconsularis itself, the population was a mix of indigenous Berbers, Carthaginian descendants who were Semitic Phoenicians, intermarried with Berber people over centuries, and the Roman colonial settlers who came in after the conquest. By the end of the 1st century AD, local African men were being recruited directly into the Roman army from this province. The garrison of North Africa by the 2nd century was, in the words of the historical record, manned mostly by local inhabitants, African men in Roman armor holding the empire's border, not slaves, not conscripts dragged in chains, professional soldiers with wages, status, and Roman citizenship on the horizon. Egypt is its own category, and it deserves its own moment. 5 million people packed into the Nile Valley and the Delta, making it one of the most densely populated territories in the ancient world. Egypt had been continuously inhabited by the same general population for over 3,000 years before Rome ever showed up. The people of Roman Egypt were not Europeans who happened to live on the African continent. They were Egyptians, descendants of the same civilization that built the pyramids, practiced medicine when Europeans were still trying to figure out why fire was hot, and whose genetic continuity with modern Egyptians and East Africans has been confirmed by ancient DNA studies. The Fayum mummy portraits, which are the most direct visual evidence we have of what ordinary people in Roman Egypt looked like during the first 3 centuries AD, show face after face after face of brown-skinned, dark-eyed, full-featured people who look like a cross-section of modern-day Northeast Africa. These are not paintings of Europeans living in Africa. These are paintings of Africans living under Roman rule, conducting Roman legal business, serving in Roman administrative positions, and being buried according to a mix of Egyptian and Roman customs. When Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BC, after Cleopatra's death, Rome didn't replace the Egyptian population. It taxed them. It conscripted them. It extracted grain from them. The 5 million people who kept Egypt running under Roman governance were African people, and that population fed Rome for 4 months of every year. The Roman military is where the argument becomes impossible to dismiss, because the army is the institution that built, expanded, and held the empire together for centuries, and the army was deeply structurally African. The Numidian cavalry is one of the most celebrated fighting forces in ancient military history. Hannibal used them against Rome during the Punic Wars, and they were so effective, they helped him almost destroy the city. When Rome finally conquered Numidia, they immediately absorbed those same cavalry tactics and those same African riders into their own military system. Numidian horsemen became a standard component of Roman armies across multiple centuries. They appear in Trajan's Column, the famous carved monument in Rome that depicts scenes from the Dacian Wars in the early 2nd century. Right there on the official state monument commemorating Roman military victory, carved in stone in the middle of Rome for everyone to see, are African soldiers. Darkly featured, tightly curled hair African soldiers doing the actual fighting on behalf of the empire. The column is not subtle about this. The African soldiers look different from the Roman legionaries because the sculptor was depicting what he actually saw. And Trajan's Column is not a fringe artifact. It is one of the most studied monuments in all of classical archaeology. It has been in Rome since 113 AD, and it's showing you black men in the Roman army over 1900 years before anyone thought to make a big deal about representation. Beyond the cavalry, the auxilia, meaning the auxiliary units that formed a massive portion of Roman military manpower by the 2nd century, was recruited heavily from provincial populations. North Africa contributed entire units. The cohorts, one Afrorum, the first cohort of Africans, is attested in multiple inscriptions. Units raised from Mauritania, from Numidia, from the Garamantian borderlands show up across the empire's military records stationed in Britain, in the Danube frontier, in the Middle East. There is an inscription found at Oshandavi on the Antonine Wall in Scotland, the northern frontier of Roman Britain, that commemorates the dedication of an altar by soldiers, including men with North African names. African men at the northern edge of Scotland, holding the Roman frontier 20 centuries ago. By the reign of Septimius Severus in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, scholars estimate the African provincial contribution to the Roman military was substantial enough that whole armies had a predominantly non-Italian, non-European ethnic composition. The empire wasn't defending itself with Italian men anymore. It was defending itself with the people of Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans, while Italian aristocrats wrote speeches about Roman virtue. Septimius Severus, born in 145 AD in Leptis Magna, a prosperous Roman city on the Libyan coast. His father's family was Punic Berber, which means descended from the Carthaginian Phoenician and Berber mix that had characterized the North African coastal population for centuries. His mother's family, the Fulvi, had Italian origins, but had been in Africa long enough to be considered African Romans. He spoke Latin with a North African accent that contemporaries remarked on. His sister came to visit him in Rome later in his life and reportedly embarrassed him because her Latin was so provincial he had to send her home. He was, in every functional sense, an African man who seized the most powerful position on earth and held it for 18 years. In 193 AD, he emerged from a civil war that followed the assassination of Emperor Pertinax, defeated two rival claimants through military force, and took the throne. He then proceeded to run the Roman Empire with an iron hand until his death in 211 AD in York, England, where he had gone to deal with trouble in Caledonia. Think about that geography. An African man dying in northern England while campaigning at the edge of the known world, having spent nearly 2 decades ruling an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. His dynasty, the Severan Dynasty, then held the imperial throne until 235 AD. That's 42 continuous years of African origin emperors running Rome at its administrative and military peak. 42 years. And the history books mention it in passing, like it's a footnote. Septimius Severus' son Caracalla took the throne after him, and in 212 AD issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, an edict that extended Roman citizenship to every free person in the empire. Every single one. All at once. Think about what that means demographically. Before 212 AD, full Roman citizenship was concentrated in Italy and the older, more heavily settled European provinces. After 212 AD, those 5 million Egyptians were Roman. Those 8 to 11 million North Africans were Roman. The Syrians, the Arabs, the Anatolians, all Roman. An African emperor looked at his empire, saw the people who were actually running it, fighting for it, feeding it, and said, "You're all Roman now." The political motivations were partly fiscal, since citizenship came with tax obligations, but the effect was a legal declaration that African, Middle Eastern, and Asian people were the full legal equals of Italians within Roman law. That's not a small thing. That's the largest single expansion of civil rights in the ancient world, issued by the son of a Libyan man. The intellectual class of Rome tells the same story from a different angle. Terence, the Roman playwright whose comedies were performed throughout the Republic and the Empire for centuries, and who influenced everything from Molière to Shakespeare, was African. Born in Carthage around 195 BC, his full name was Publius Terentius Afer, and Afer literally means the African. He was brought to Rome as a slave, educated by his owner, Senator Terentius Lucanus, who then freed him. He wrote 6 comedies, all of which survived intact, which is extraordinary since most ancient literature is lost. His face appears on ancient manuscripts as a dark-complexioned man. Roman history remembers him as one of the greatest writers in the Latin language, and his African origin is right there in his name, hiding in plain sight. Apuleius of Madaros, who wrote The Golden Ass, there's the only Latin novel to survive in complete form from antiquity, was a Berber African from what is now Algeria. His work is studied in every classist department in the Western world and has been for 500 years. Fronto of Cirta, considered the greatest Latin orator of the 2nd century after Cicero himself, was North African. He was so respected that Emperor Marcus Aurelius studied rhetoric under him. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, sitting at the feet of an African teacher. And then Augustine of Hippo, born in 354 AD in Thagaste, modern Algeria, whose mother Monica was almost certainly Berber, whose theological writings became the intellectual backbone of Western Christianity, and whose influence on European philosophy through the medieval period and into the Reformation is so total that calling him a major figure is an understatement. Augustine didn't influence Western thought from the margins. He is one of the 4 or 5 people on whose ideas the entire structure of Western Christian civilization was built. African man, Algerian city, writing in Latin, thinking in a tradition formed by the intersection of African, Greek, and Jewish intellectual currents. That's the actual genealogy of the ideas Europe calls its own. So, how do you take all of this, all these African emperors, African soldiers, African writers, African farmers feeding the capital, and turn it into the white marble world that fills every Hollywood production and every high school textbook? You do it the same way it always gets done. You start with the Renaissance, when European artists began painting the ancient world in their own image. Raphael's School of Athens, painted between 1509 and 1511, depicts the great philosophers of antiquity in the architectural style of ancient Rome, with a cast that looks entirely like 16th century Italians. There's no visual acknowledgement that Aristotle spent time in the Middle East, that Ptolemy was Egyptian, that the Neoplatonists were North African and Syrian. They all look Roman in the way a Renaissance Italian imagined Roman, which meant they look European. That template, set during the Renaissance, compounded forward. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published in 1776, became the foundational text of how educated English speakers understood Roman history. And Gibbon's framing was aggressively Eurocentric, treating the Eastern and African portions of the empire as peripheral, and treating the Western European legacy as the real inheritance of Rome. Then Hollywood locked the image in permanently. Ben-Hur, Spartacus, Gladiator, every major Roman epic puts white actors in togas and sends them across landscapes that are clearly not Northern Europe, while never once casting the production to reflect the actual demographics. A Gladiator filmed in 2000, set in 180 AD during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, who was tutored by an African orator, with a cast drawn almost entirely from Northern European actors. The erasure isn't accidental. It's a creative choice made over and over across 500 years of art, literature, and cinema, each iteration making the next one seem more natural until the fiction becomes the default and the truth becomes the controversy. Then the bones started talking and the story got harder to maintain. Ancient DNA studies, which have exploded in the last decade as the technology to sequence degraded genetic material has improved, have been pulling the rug out from under the whitewashed version of ancient history, one study at a time. A 2019 study of ancient Roman genomes published in Science found that the genetic profile of imperial era Romans looked dramatically different from modern Italians, with significant ancestry from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, and North Africa. The city of Rome itself during the imperial period showed a genetic profile much closer to modern Lebanese and Egyptian people than to modern Northern Italians. The population of the city of Rome in its peak centuries was, genetically speaking, a Mediterranean and Near Eastern population with substantial African input, not a Northern European population that happened to live in Italy. Separate studies of ancient North African populations have confirmed continuous genetic presence of sub-Saharan African ancestry in the Maghreb going back thousands of years, which means the North African Romans weren't just Caucasian Berbers in a modern sense. They carried complex African genetic histories that reflected thousands of years of trans-Saharan contact, movement, and intermarriage. The ground is literally giving back the evidence that the paintings tried to bury. Here's where it all lands in your chest. The civilization that the Western world credits as the foundation of its law, its architecture, its political theory, its military organization, its engineering, and its literature was not a white European project. It was a Mediterranean and African superstate whose African provinces fed it, whose African soldiers defended it, whose African emperors directed it at its peak, whose African writers gave it its greatest surviving literature, and whose African theologians shaped the Christianity that Europe later used to justify the transatlantic slave trade. Every time someone says Western civilization and means white civilization, they are making a claim that the demographic reality of the Roman Empire itself completely contradicts. The Africans weren't on the outside of Rome looking in. They were inside the Senate, inside the barracks, inside the palaces, on the throne, and in the grain ships keeping the capital fed. And if that makes you want to go open a history book and check, good. Because the evidence isn't hidden. It never was. It's been sitting in the demographic tables, on Trajan's column, in the name Publius Terentius Afer, in the birthplace of Septimius Severus, in the DNA pulled from the graves under Rome. The only thing that buried it was a sustained 500-year campaign by people who needed Rome to look like them. It didn't. It looked like the world.